Hello, in this series, I wanted to kind of start off something that I think will be a really, really long process and is kind of like a bigger video project that I really want to undertake and I'm really hopeful about undertaking. And that's the idea of just doing a series on postmodernism and talking about different authors that are often read in debate that are reading from postmodernism and maybe not giving a full, huge breakdown of every type of argument that they make and all of the kind of thoughts that they've had or writing that they've written, but somewhere that you can definitely refer to as a place to kind of get a quick hand on like what these authors are saying, how you should understand it in a debate context, and the arguments that are most popularly read, and then obviously like some videos that'll probably accompany this in order to make sure that you kind of understand how some of the advice that I'm giving in videos that are more broad applies to different ways that you can use it on the flow. I think whether you're a team that's reading Baudrillard or whether you're a team that wants to understand Baudrillard so that you can better answer it, the kind of section of videos that I'll be doing here I think will really be helpful for you in really developing understanding this as a set of arguments in debate. And I think it's definitely important because I think it's something that even when there aren't many people reading it on the circuit, I think there are a lot of ways in which the teams that do usually read this are really in-depth in literature and end up popping like a lot of teams that just aren't really prepared for the type of debate that they really want to have with these types of arguments. Additionally, I think that when you're learning about these types of arguments, they can definitely give you an alternative way of just thinking about the resolution and thinking about the ways in which different teams can attack the resolution. I think on the future resolution, the water resolution, a lot of questions that come from postmodernism will be incredibly relevant on the topic because I think that they're water as like something to write about or water as like a topic for people to theorize from, I think is something that has been used in so many literature bases and so in so many ways, like water as kind of like a resource, water as, you know, something that is also a resource and something that's within our body, water as, you know, something that signifies a certain relationship to the world or something like that. And so I think that there are a lot of ways in which people will use postmodernism on the upcoming topics, which makes these particular, I think, videos maybe more pertinent than some of the stuff that I've been doing before. And so I kind of want to start off by talking about Baudrillard or Jean Baudrillard. I think that this is a good place to start because it's one of the most commonly read authors in debate, and I think it's also someone who you will definitely see a lot as a person people reference both as in joke and a lot of seriousness in terms of talking about just how prevalent this argument has been in various decades of debate, various eras of debate. And I think that a lot of the writing that Baudrillard does, I think, is particularly pertinent for being able to understand how you fully want to answer criticisms that don't really follow a lot of lines that other ones do. And I think that being able to understand some of the central arguments that Jean Baudrillard makes is particularly important. Jean Baudrillard, for a little bit of background, is a French sociologist and philosopher writing from the 1970s and 80s. He wrote multiple books that stretched and spoke over a bunch of different topics, political, cultural, economic, that talked about various ways in which we understand the world, not through the lens of like things as they manifest materially, but more through the sources of representation. A lot of arguments that people make that are central to the debate, and the ones that I'm going to focus on in here, because like I said before, it really isn't a place where I'm going to get all of the thoughts that I kind of have on Baudrillard in general. But lots of the arguments that I think are really pertinent to the debate are the ones that are about signs and simulacra, and the arguments that are being made about the precession of simulacra and symbolic exchange. So the basic kind of idea I think that is often easiest to use is like something like a car or a shoe, right? So when you think of a car or a shoe, right, it kind of signifies like this thing that does exist, right? And so if you kind of like have a shoe or a car, there's a thing that literally exists. And then let's say the shoe is a Nike shoe or the car is a Mercedes Benz. The kind of like price or the value of that car goes up based off of just even saying what brand is associated with it. The difference between a shoe whose brand like doesn't really exist or is like just kind of like a store brand versus like an Adidas, a Nike, etc. All of these things kind of in a value that's external to the shoe itself, right? Because the shoe itself may be worth like whatever, you know, amount was put into making it, you know, the $2 or whatever that was put into actually putting the shoe together. But the name on it itself, the design itself, you know, the credits to the designers, etc., all those things, that type of like value that exists external to what you're just buying with a literal usage of the shoe, represents this kind of like excess that Baudrillard finds particularly interesting. For Baudrillard, basically these kind of like processes of thinking about this kind of external value to that commodity is what is kind of thought of as like sign value, and it is a way that kind of like produces how we think about not just entities but sources of representation broadly. Baudrillard takes a lot of the arguments that he's making about the relationships between sign, signification, and simulacra, and he says that society has become so saturated with simulacra and our lives are so saturated with the constructs of society that all meaning has essentially become meaningless because it is all kind of a representation of something else. That if there is this constant procession of simulacra, the constant procession of understanding the world through a series of representations and not particularly like the existence of real events or real commodities, etc., there's this kind of like excess that continues to remake itself, and when it produces more and more simulacra, there's this kind of oversaturation happens that makes it impossible for us to tell the difference between the value of something that is being produced and the value of its representation. For Baudrillard, this is like a key critical question that drives a lot of his writing in terms of thinking about the ways in which we formulate politics, think about things like warfare, i.e. the difference between what warfare becomes like on the ground versus how it's represented in the news, how it's written about, how people create theories and various ways of representing that warfare and ways to draw kind of shock value from the public. And so for Baudrillard, a lot of the ways that he's studying this in relationship to questions of Marxism, in relationship to some questions like Bataille, which I'll definitely talk about in some other places, and being able to kind of do all these things basically gives him a way to use his arguments about science signification to talk about a broad relationship towards like the way in which we think about the formulation of politics as a whole and the relationship between politics, information, and kind of like public persuasion. I think that this is particularly important for the types of questions that are asked in a debate, both in the affirmative and the negative, because I think that on both sides it asks a real question about what debate does as a source of representation for how we think about the own types of impacts that we discuss in terms of the way in which debate has to kind of become a place for us to use things like tools like such as fiat, the planning of future policy, the representation of people that are suffering as a way to justify things like impact calculus, etc., while also simultaneously asking questions about like the efficacy of actually being able to turn information into something that actually persuades and changes policy. For Baudrillard, the idea that information is persuasive is actually incorrect and that information is actually dissuasive. It does not make people act in such a way to like transition or make a radical changes to society. Rather, it more so seduces them into like the normative means of cultural production that exists in the status quo and solidifies that system in such a way that there is no kind of separation between the times of like literal resources, commodities that are necessary, and the types of like various symbolic values that have been created in relationship to them. These kind of like various exchanges and relationships are also very important, I think, when thinking about the water topic, because I think water as a resource is one of those crises that you see kind of reflected in media both abroad and domestically that kind of shows this crisis and whether or not we've connected this problem of water to things like climate change, to questions of scarcity, capitalism, etc. And I think that in that particular topic, Baudrillard can raise a lot of interesting questions on the affirmative and the negative about how we think about water as like whether or not the question of like is there enough available versus like what are the types of systems and structure that are creating and producing scarcity, and how does that become reflected on the ways that we think about impact calculus, the way that we debate, etc. And these types of questions I think are the ones that are going to lead me through a lot of the videos that I end up doing, talking about how Baudrillard gets implemented into various debate strategies and the way that I think that you should respond to them. Hopefully this video was helpful and at least giving you a kind of quick flash into some of the stuff that Baudrillard talks about and giving you a little bit of ideas of the ways in which his arguments about signs, symbol, simulacra, etc. relates to the kinds of questions that are raised in debate and the types of things that will end up being pertinent debates that you have on this topic. Thank you.